Hey, what if there was a way to predict when emerging markets would really start taking off very quickly? And what if that was something that most people never thought about? Well, there actually is a few things like this, and this isn't going to be like a get rich quick video, and I'm not going to be pointing at specific countries and economies or regions of America for that matter where this is actually true. This is just something to keep in the back of your mind. Here's the general framework. Basically, the largest driver of stock market returns has been an increase in corporate earnings because price to earnings multiples haven't really moved that much over time when you remove recessions, when, like prices crash and stuff like that. So, if you look at things on a very long term perspective, it's actually been corporate earnings that has driven the vast increases in the stock market since before the Great Depression. So where do corporate earnings come from? They basically come from GDP, right? So when earnings increase, the intuition is GDP also increases. This is very simple. How does GDP increase? Well, there are things like inflation, blah, 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 but generally speaking, the biggest driver of GDP increase is an increase in population and an increase in productivity. And so productivity is literally just how much economic activity is generated per hour worked. So the one of the interesting things, if you go back in history, there are certain industries that have been hugely profitable, right? Like early days America, it was tobacco. Coffee is huge. What do all these things have in common? Well, they're actually stimulants. They're cheap stimulants that are just widely available, right? In America, cocaine used to be in soda and stuff. Okay. What you have to understand is this. It's actually interesting, but it's economic fact. There's research papers on this, that when you introduce coffee into an economy, productivity skyrockets and the GDP takes off, right? Same thing with tobacco. These low-cost stimulants are actually crazy effective at increasing GDP, right? And so, these days you have things like, vapes and Zins and all this other stuff. Why? Well, I mean, really the reason why is because smoking has gone down in America, right? And so, what you need to understand is, when you look across the world, if there's a country that, isn't using a lot of stimulants, if you learn that those people are going to start adopting, stimulants, then you can expect with actually a very high degree of certainty that that economy is going to increase its growth rate a lot. And conversely, right? Like if you see a country has a huge campaign against caffeine and nicotine and other sorts of stimulants, then, over a long-term period, you'd actually expect their growth rate to flatten out a little bit. Like it doesn't necessarily mean the stock market's going to crash the next day, but if you're looking at emerging markets, and you see an emerging market that, has a lot of features that you like, and then also on top of that, they don't use a lot of stimulants, right? Like maybe they're kind of a chill lifestyle. They haven't been, fully brought into the hyper competitive, industrialized, globalized, world economy. If you also know that they're going to adopt stimulants, very soon, that could actually be a great position for a long-term investor. So I think, that's something to think about as well. If you're trying to get into that kind of space, like depressants, like weed, alcohol, these things also help, I think, productivity a little bit. I haven't read economic papers on this because I think they allow people to work longer hours and cope with the hardships of doing that. However, at the same time, I think there's also a lot of evidence that alcohol isn't super good for productivity. I think for obvious reasons. I think marijuana, same thing. So it's a little bit of a push-pull relationship there. Also, obviously, though, a country that decides to prohibit these coping mechanisms, like alcohol and marijuana and stuff like that, then you would expect their criminal underbelly to expand meaningfully because people desperately want those coping mechanisms. We saw that in Prohibition, the rise of the mafia, and obviously, weed, marijuana, right? That's been a huge, criminal enterprise in the States, because marijuana used to be legal. It was criminalized. That led to this big expansion in criminal economy, basically to supply weed to people who wanted it. And, now as we're, legalizing it across the country, you would expect that to decrease, just like the Italian mafia decreased after Prohibition was basically undone. So these are just things to think about. But actually, like the consumption habits of chemical substances in an economy, and this can also apply to opioids in the Midwest, changes in these, changes in the use of these substances have direct impacts on productivity, which has direct impacts on GDP growth for that region or that country, which has direct impacts on the corporate profits for that region or that country. And so it's actually something like you actually need to pay attention to, in addition to like all these other factors. What kinds of chemicals are people consuming, and how is that trending? Are the younger generations moving away from stimulants? Well, that actually would be a headwind, right? It would be like you would want to deflate your expectations, right, for that investment in that country or region. So, not something you could probably trade on immediately, but it's something to think about, I think. And especially, on Wall Street, people have a reputation for taking, ADHD medication, cocaine, drinking like 6+ cups of coffee a day. Guilty, so on the coffee thing. But, it's something to think about. Productivity, stimulants, very closely tied. So any kind of changes in that, you really actually should pay attention to it. Anyway, just a quick little video, and hope that was entertaining. It's definitely interesting. I thought it was kind of funny when I learned about it. Like and subscribe for more tips.